Hi, my name is Mark Bolton and I'm a Principal Conservation Scientist at the RSPB, and I'm talking about a project commissioned by Marine Scotland in 2020 which the RSPB is currently delivering. So the project is focused on improving our understanding of the marine distribution of two seabird species, Leach's storm petrel and the European storm petrel, which have both been very poorly studied to date and for which there's virtually no information on their marine distribution from specific SPAs. So prior to this project, there had been no tracking at all of Leach's petrels anywhere in the UK, and there was only one tracking study of European storm petrels from Shetland. So the project was initially envisaged as a 2-year study starting in 2020, but it was halted within weeks of being commissioned due to COVID, and it was then paused again in 2022 due to the outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza. So 4 years after the project was initiated, we've only been able to collect 2 years of data so far, and the project will now have a third and final season in 2024, funded by the Scottish Government Marine Directorate. So these maps show the distribution of these two species in Britain and Ireland, with the UK SPAs indicated in red. As I'm sure you're aware, these species are restricted to the islands of the north and west coasts of the UK, and many of these islands are extremely difficult to access, let alone for field workers to stay there for any length of time to collect data, which in part explains the lack of existing information on these species. Another reason is the very small size of these seabirds. So the European storm petrel is about the size of a sparrow, and Leach's petrel about the size of a starling, which severely limits the size of tracking devices that can be deployed on these birds. So whilst we can now track many seabirds with tags that remotely offload data, which means we can track more individuals, we can track them more easily, and we can track them for longer, there are currently no remote download tags that are small enough to be deployed on storm petrels. So we need to catch the tagged birds a second time to remove their tags to obtain the tracking data, and that's a considerable constraint when working on these birds. And when you add to that the fact that these species are only active at the colony at night, and they nest out of sight in burrows and rock crevices, it's really not surprising that we know so little about them. So we carried out GPS tracking of Leach's petrels from their largest UK colony on St Kilda in 2021 and 2023. And tagging was carried out between mid-June and the end of July, when birds were incubating eggs and rearing chicks. And birds were caught as they left their burrows to begin a foraging trip, and small GPS tags were fitted to the tail. They were then retrapped when they returned to the colony after one or perhaps after several foraging trips. We achieved really high tag retrieval rates. In 2021, we tagged 15 birds and retrapped all 15 individuals, retrieving tags from 14 of them, so one bird had lost its tag. And in 2023, we tagged 20 birds and retrieved 19 tags. And it's clear from these plots of the tracks in relation to sea depth that these birds are deep water specialists. You can see they're mainly using water over 1,000 metres deep, and they often track along the edge of the seabed slope. And although there are several offshore wind farm development areas shown in green within the foraging radius of the birds, none of the tracked individuals use these areas during the period of data collection. And looking at trip metrics in the table on the top right hand side, the birds are at sea for periods of up to 4 days, and they ranged up to 550 kilometres from the colony, although the average foraging range was between about 250 and 350 kilometres, dependent on the year and the breeding stage. And there was a tendency for birds to spend longer at sea and to travel further from the colony during the incubation stage than when they were rearing chicks. The tracking of European storm petrels was carried out in the Treshnish Isles in the Inner Hebrides, which is one of the largest colonies in the UK. And the terrain is a lot less challenging than on St Kilda, but there are absolutely no facilities for field workers on the island. So birds were tracked between late July and late August during both the incubation and chick rearing phases. And again, we achieved really good recapture rates in both years, although in 2021, 2 birds lost their tags, and there were some problems downloading data from a couple of the retrieved tags, so we didn't get complete trips for 2 birds. Plots of the tracks show that the European storm petrels tend to be much more neritic than Leach's petrels, so they forage over the shallower waters of the continental shelf and rarely venture beyond the shelf edge. Indeed, in 2021, when we tracked a larger sample of birds, none went beyond the shelf edge. But there were some big differences in the foraging behaviour between the 2 years. In 2021, birds are mainly concentrated to the west in waters within 200 kilometres of the colony, whereas in 2023, when the birds were in much poorer condition and the chicks were being really poorly fed, birds travelled a lot further. They were travelling up to 480 kilometres from the colony and in a greater range of directions. So several birds headed a long way south into the Irish Sea. One bird travelled a long way west, well beyond the edge of the continental shelf, and another went north through the Minch to the north of Lewis. And this bird travelled through the development area N3, which is about 250 kilometres distant from the colony. And I should stress, all these individuals were breeding. They all had small chicks in their nests. So these data do serve to emphasise the importance of carrying out multi-annual tracking, since behaviour can vary really a lot from one year to another. And of course, we currently have no information about how foraging areas may change during the course of the breeding season, which lasts from May into October. And finally, although each bird was only tracked for a few days, quite a number of the tracked birds entered one of the wind farm development areas. In 2021, 7 of the 19 tracked birds entered plan option area W1, which is to the south of Trashnish. And in 2023, 9 of the 12 birds entered that area, and a 10th bird entered area N3, as I've just mentioned. I'll stop there, and I'd like to finish by acknowledging the funding sources for this project and those who have permitted and facilitated this work. Thank you very much.
I'm going to talk to you today about some work that we did under funding from Marine Scotland with MacArthur Green, facilitated by the University of Glasgow, looking at the population of Manx shearwaters on the Isle of Rum, a population that's actually quite important worldwide for such a small place. It holds about 25 to 30% of the world's breeding population. And the concern surrounding this population is that even though at the moment there's perceived to be very little overlap with offshore wind farms, the incoming ScotWind programme will see some proximate developments. So there's obviously interest to see what effects these might have on this very important. Our task was to first review all the available data, not just for Rum, but for any neighbouring population or location, to then fit an integrated population to all of these data simultaneously, using this fitted model to reconstruct the historical dynamics of the population, not just in terms of abundance, but also in terms of demographic process, and then to see how additional anthropogenic effects like mortality or reduced breeding success might affect the Rum population into the short and longer term. To this particular system is that although there's an abundance of different types of data, and some of them are actually quite long term, the availability of data is quite patchy. Some of the aspects of the system, like recruitment, for example, are totally unobserved, and some of the crucial sources of information, like the number of breeding pairs, are collected intermittently. In this case, if you look at plate F, 7 surveys conducted at different points in time, but crucially, the methodologies used for these different surveys have tended to vary. So the results obtained from those surveys are not strictly comparable. What you're seeing here is, just for illustration purposes, the trajectories are imaginary, but the dots and the uncertainties around the dots indicate the timing and precision of observations obtained in relation to each other. The approach that we've Our approach to modeling that problem had three priorities: to integrate all the available information into a single platform, to use mechanistic principles of demography, dynamics, and life history to connect these data and constrain what the model could do, and to make sure that we appear to be, in our predictions, no certain than we're justified in being by propagating uncertainty to both parameter estimates and predictions all the way to the end of the results. A brief description of the model. The model was very simply comprised of an update equation that produced next year's population in terms of the surviving component of adults from this year and the contribution of new recruits coming into the population. All of the demographic processes in this update rule were time varying and expressed in terms of covariates. So, for example, all the survivals were expressed as logistic functions of covariates with over-dispersion. The fecundity, again, was expressed as a logit function of covariates. The survival of juveniles from chicks to recruitment was described as a sort of cumulative survival over 4 years. And recruitment into the breeding population was expressed as a density-dependent function in terms of two parameters, row 0 and row 1. Having fitted this model to data, to the collection of data that I talked about earlier, we obtained a reconstruction of the adult population with associated precision around the median trend, but also reconstructions of some of the less directly observed processes, like, for example, recruitment and other demographic processes of interest with associated credible intervals. From this, two things are clear. The first one was that we certainly improved on the precision of our population estimates by analyzing all the survey data simultaneously, rather than just looking at their individual confidence intervals that were essentially the result of sampling uncertainty. And secondly, that it appears that although the population has undergone some drastic declines in the past, it is not currently experiencing one. In terms of the forecasting scenarios, just to explain the plot here, looking into the future, we're interested to find out whether the population will be stable, go up, or go down. So for illustration purposes, we use two time horizons of 25 years and 100 years into the future. So what you're looking here in deeper red is the 50% credible intervals for those predictions, and in pink, the 95% credible intervals. And the numbers annotated here say that there's a 10% chance that in the next 25 years, the population will be smaller than it is now, and an 8% chance that in 100 years, the population will be smaller than it is now. Having had this prediction, we can now start introducing some anthropogenic effects, such as, for example, in this scenario, a 5% per annum extra adult mortality, which immediately results in a 70% chance of the population being smaller in the future, both the 25 and 100 year horizon. In contrast, a very drastic but short-lived effect, such as a 50% one-off adult mortality this year, leads in the short term to some reductions, but in the long term is indistinguishable from the status quo. So the third key conclusion here, from the very few forecasting scenarios that we looked at, the code and fitted model is available for people to play with. Small but persistent effects on adult survival appear to have greater long-lasting effects than very drastic but short-lived impacts on any other aspect of demography. So this kind of work is an example of a state space model fitted to multiple different types of data There are a number of different examples of such models applied not just to different species of seabird, but various other interesting systems, from disease all the way to marine and terrestrial systems. So thank you very much.
Hi, I'm Ros Green and I'm a part-time PhD student at the University of Liverpool and a research ecologist at the British Trust for Ornithology. Today I'll give you a quick overview of the Migration Vulnerability Assessment framework I've developed during my PhD and the case study I've used to test this, which utilises information from 2 ScotMER projects. Overall, my PhD focuses on the migration of common shell duck in relation to offshore wind farms. My GPS tracking data, stable isotope analysis and population trends investigation will reduce offshore wind farm consenting uncertainties for this species, but today I'll present the results of my first chapter, which is a vulnerability assessment I've conducted for all migratory and Attidae species in relation to offshore wind farms, and the overarching assessment framework I've developed from this. The Attidae family contains geese, ducks, swans, sawbills and sea ducks. Within those 5 overarching groups, I've assessed these 29 migratory populations and how vulnerable they are to offshore wind farm interactions as they migrate overseas within the UK exclusive economic zone, bounded by the red line on this map. I then selected these 8 relevant assessment metrics and quantified each on a scale of 1 to 5. For half of these, I extracted relevant data from this ScotMER funded strategic review, which also provided further information that helped with the initial selection of the 8 metrics. I used other data sources to quantify the remaining 4 metrics. Once quantified, the metric values were added together to create these 2 overarching scores, which were further added together to create a severity index. This gives an indication of the severity of interaction if any of the species do encounter an offshore wind farm on migration. The severity index showed that geese and swans generally have a higher severity of interaction, which is mainly driven by differences in the population status and demography score, shown here in orange. The behaviour and morphology scores, shown in blue, are similar for all Anatidae due to uncertainties in the available data for the behavioural metrics. However, the severity index gives no indication of whether these species will actually interact with offshore wind farms during migration. For that, you need a measure of exposure. I produced an exposure score using this new avian migration collision risk model, which was the output of work package 2 of the ScotMER funded project I mentioned earlier. With this online tool, you can select the relevant offshore wind farms within the migratory corridor of your assessment species. You can then select the relevant species and then generate an estimate of the mean number of interactions each individual within that migratory population might have with the selected offshore wind farms, by simulating migration tracks and randomly sampling these iteratively, like the red tracks displayed on this map. This process was straightforward as all the necessary parameters for the wind farms and species are saved within the online software. This mean number of interactions for each individual gave the exposure score, which I then multiplied by the severity index to give the vulnerability index. I ranked the species from the most to the least vulnerable, as shown here, and then conducted an uncertainty analysis on these results. This showed that even when uncertainty in the raw data was accounted for, the top 5 populations always ranked in the top 5 positions, and the bottom 8 populations are always ranked there. No species group was consistently more vulnerable than another, but generally the sawbills, sea ducks and swans are more vulnerable than geese and ducks. The most consistent variable influencing the vulnerability index was the number of offshore wind farms within each migratory corridor, which is closely linked to the main seas the species are migrating over. Those populations migrating over the North Sea, and particularly the southern North Sea, have a much greater chance of being exposed to offshore wind farms than those migrating over the Atlantic Ocean or Irish Sea. It's important to note that this assessment only accounted for the exposure to offshore wind farms within the UK EEZ and didn't account for exposure within the seas of any other country. Therefore, the real-world exposure score for migrants crossing the North Sea is likely to be higher than that produced within my assessment. We have now expanded the assessment process I developed for migratory Attidae into a framework that can be adapted to any species group during migration, which may be exposed to a spatially explicit anthropogenic stressor. such as floating wind farm cables, tidal turbines, onshore wind farms, power lines, buildings, roads, etc. I'm currently in the process of publishing this framework and the Migratory and Asset Vulnerability Assessment. So, to conclude, I've completed the first vulnerability assessment for an Attidae and used the outputs from these two ScotMER projects to help with this, and in doing so have identified the most and least vulnerable populations to offshore wind farm impacts whilst on migration through the UK EEZ. This should help streamline environmental impact assessment processes and reduce consenting uncertainties. I've identified the sea areas within migratory corridors where wind farm exposure is highest. Those species migrating over the North Sea are more vulnerable than those migrating over the Atlantic. The rate of development within the North Sea is further increasing the likelihood of exposure. In future, planning decisions for the offshore wind farm industry may need to take this increased likelihood of exposure into consideration. I've developed a method for testing the impact of data uncertainty on the vulnerability ranking. This helps ascertain which uncertainties impact the ranking, but more importantly helps identify where reductions in uncertainty will have no impact on the overall vulnerability ranking. For example, reducing the uncertainty within flight altitude data for the 16 middle-ranked Attidae species will increase the certainty of their rank positions, but will have no impact on the species ranked in the 5 most and 8 least vulnerable populations, shown here either side of the red lines. The methodology used for the Attidae assessment can now be applied to any species group that may be exposed to any spatially explicit stressor whilst on migration. If this standard framework is adopted for future vulnerability assessments, it should make it easier for practitioners to compare the results of multiple assessments and identify species groups that are consistently vulnerable to any variety of stressors. And finally, this has highlighted the importance of conducting these assessments across human borders rather than restricting them to geopolitical areas such as the UK EEZ. The exposure scores for species migrating over the North Sea are an underestimate as they do not include exposure to offshore wind farms within the waters of other countries bordering the North Sea. Thank you for listening, and if you want to follow the progress of my PhD, you can on my website, and please email me if I don't get a chance to fully answer your questions now. I'd also like to acknowledge my funders and thank these organisations for supporting my PhD.